I'm going to record now, and Bruce, I'm going to kick it off to you to introduce Bryant.
Okay, thank you. Back in the summer, I think it came out that the Forest Service was looking to use some sort of emergency process to log a portion of Pine Mountain in the Los Padres National Forest and to clear chaparral and other brush from an area nearby. And they were going to do that without any public comment and all of that. So Friends of Los Padres National Forest um, immediately sent out an alarm and wrote a letter to which we signed on, um, recording our objection to that action. And of course, there's a lot of that sort of thing that's been happening in recent times. Anyways, as a result, I thought it would be a good idea to have Bryant Baker, who is the conservation director, I think it is, of Los Padres, talk about that program and about the forest in general and about some other things relating to forest clearing, forest recovery. He's done a lot of work in the Thomas Fire area, documenting what has happened in the couple of years since, 3 years since now, since the fire. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bryant.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Cynthia. Thanks for everyone who is here. And thanks for having me. I really am excited to be here. Always excited to talk about the Los Padres National Forest. Not so excited to talk about logging or threats, really, but I've got plenty of stuff that I'll cover that I think are really fun and beautiful. So it won't be so depressing as you might think. But you know, I have been doing this for the last 4 years at Los Padres Forest Watch, working in the Los Padres National Forest and some other public lands in the region. I'm our conservation director. I handle all of our technical stuff. So I write our comment letters and I do anything that requires analysis of science or data. Uh, I'm sort of the guy who's behind the scenes on all of that. I also do a lot of educational activities. I lead a lot of hikes, educational hikes, usually about chaparral or about fire ecology. Uh, it's not been so fun with the pandemic. Normally, I would be out leading hikes and doing things in person, and we'd probably be having this presentation in person. But I think it is nice that perhaps more people are able to connect with us via Zoom, who maybe wouldn't have been able to go on a hike or do other things. So um, I'm going to talk tonight, about a lot of different things, different threats, different ways that the Los Padres National Forest is affected by certain activities. And I'm going to talk about the Pine Mountain Project specifically, and also really highlight some really wonderful, wonderful things that are happening in the Los Padres National Forest, especially after fire. I think it's hopefully going to be a little bit more uplifting than you might expect. The Forest Service is this big agency. It's under the Department of Agriculture, and they manage the national forest system across the United States. And the sort of the mantra of the national forest system of national forest is the land of many uses. And that's because there are all these different things that can happen in national forests. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But because of this multi-use mandate that the agency has, it also means that there are a lot of activities that may be more environmentally damaging than you might expect that are allowed to occur in national forests. So sometimes we call it the land of many threats. But again, there is so much wonder and enchantment and just magic that happens in Los Padres National Forest in this amazing place that is right here in our backyard. So I will talk quite a bit about that as well. And I want to see real quick, how long did it take to go to the next slide? Can you see the next slide? I just want to get a sense of the delay. Super quick. Okay, good, great. Sometimes the delay is like 10 seconds long. I just want to make sure I'm not talking about something that you can't see on the screen. So before I do any of that, because this is Audubon Society, I have been to Audubon presentations before. I've given presentations at other chapters, and I know you like birds. I know you like photos of birds, and I can already I can't see everybody's faces, but I know some of you are nodding along and saying, yep, just get to the bird part, stop talking about it and just show us. And I don't know if you do a bird of the week, bird of the month. I've got a bird of the week that I want to show you. This was on Sunday. I got to see this, and I think it's a pretty interesting thing. So does anybody know what this bird is?
Ooh, Townsend's warbler.
Townsend's warbler. Bruce, you're too quick. Yeah. So okay. So you all know Townsend's warbler. It's an absolutely stunning bird. It's pretty small. What I found so interesting was that I found this with my good friend Rick Halsey, who is actually has given a presentation with the chapter like a year ago. You may if you went to his presentation, you may remember that. But we were out on this beach in Goleta and came across this Townsend warbler that was actually foraging on the beach. Now,
Wow.
Can anybody tell me why that's a little bit unusual?
Yeah, it's more a forest bird or a riparian bird.
Right. It's yeah, it spends most of its time up in the coniferous forest of British Columbia, the Pacific Northwest, and it spends most of its time pretty high up in the treetops. So it's not like it's an understory, shrub-loving bird. This thing is up in the trees, up in the conifers, and it does migrate south for the winter. And we are lucky enough to have it come down here along the coast. But it's kind of unusual to see it on a beach. And not only that, but it was actually foraging. So it was in these little kelp piles going after a lot of the flies and the delicious bugs, similar to like what the shorebirds are doing. And so we just spent an hour, following this little warbler around, and it was such a magical experience getting to watch it on the beach. And these are I'm not a great bird photographer, but I got really lucky.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, he was not shy at all, and it just stopped right in front of us, just a couple feet away. And it was a really lovely experience. So I wanted to share that with you. I figured if anybody would appreciate this, it would be the Audubon Society.
Indeed.
Yes, so great. So that is my bird of the week. There will be more birds in this presentation. Don't worry. None of them are as good as these photos, but most of the I think all the photos you're going to see, except for maybe one, are mine. So just in case you're curious, I'm also a photographer. So the Los Padres National Forest, the one thing that I think comes to mind for those who know it is that it's big. It is huge. It's probably the second or third largest national forest in California, depending on how you measure it. The first is the Shasta Trinity National Forest, farther north. And then there's kind of some debate about how we actually talk about the size. Is it just the boundary? Is it the actual public land within the boundary? How there's some national forests that actually overlap state boundaries, so do those count? Anyway, I kind of think of it as the second largest in the state. And it's almost 2 million acres. It's huge. It goes all the way from Santa Clarita down here in, not too far from Ventura, all the way up to Monterey, Carmel, that area. And there's kind of a gap in between in San Luis Obispo County. But if you've ever been up to Big Sur, there's a good chance that you're actually in the Los Padres National Forest. It's adjacent to a lot of the state parks up there. And then, of course, it just really is this huge piece of land in the Ventura County backcountry and the Santa Barbara backcountry. So it's this amazing wonderland that we have right here in our backyard, and it's a biodiversity hotspot where you can see all these colorful things here. These are all different ecoregions, and so there's a lot of different ecoregions that come together in the Los Padres National Forest area, and so. just to name some of those, and to give you a sense of what they look like, if you aren't super familiar, this is my home. This is where I spend most of my time, is the chaparral. I'm like a wren tit or a bush tit. I really try to get in the shrubs there. This is easily the most dominant ecosystem we have in the Los Padres and really in the region. It covers over 70% of the actual national forest area. So it probably shouldn't be called a national forest. It there's not nearly as much forest as there is shrubland. So maybe it should be like the Los Padres National Shrubland or something. But so it often confuses people because they go out into the Los Padres and they're like, where are all the trees? They're there. You got to know where to look. And I'm going to talk about like Pine Mountain, for example, great example. But there is the elfin forest, the chaparral, and it is quite an amazing place to visit. There's also coastal sage scrub, which is like chaparral's sort of little sibling. We sometimes call it soft chaparral. It's smaller shrubs, usually easier to walk through. Lots of lovely flowering shrubs like monkey flower, things like that. Not nearly as common, and we've lost quite a bit of it over the last couple centuries. But you find it on drier sites, usually on south-facing slopes. It's another lovely ecosystem, very similar to chaparral. There's also sagebrush scrub. So this is like what you might see if you went to the Great Basin, if you went to the east side of the Sierra, into Nevada or even Utah. We have kind of our own miniature Great Basin in the Los Padres. It's really fascinating. It's up if you actually go to the other side of Pine Mountain. So if you go on the north side of Pine Mountain, you get into this sort of it's almost like desert, but also it's you got all the sagebrush scrub and these forests. It's a really cool place. And so you see a lot of Great Basin sagebrush and rabbit brush, things that you don't normally see in our region, which is pretty fun. A lot of oak woodland, especially like on those shaded north slopes. You go farther north, there's a lot of oak woodland up in San Luis Obispo County, up in the Big Sur area. So this is, often growing right next to chaparral, usually mixes with chaparral quite a bit as well. We have a lot of different forest types. We have pinyon juniper, and our pinyon forests are pretty unique. They're extremely old. They are very large pinyons. Pinyons, if you go out to like Nevada and see pinyon pines, they're often like shrubs, but we have really large pinyon pines, which is pretty cool. They're very slow growing species, so they're quite old in some areas. Not as much juniper, but this is what we call pinyon juniper woodland or pinyon juniper forest. We have a lot of Jeffrey pine or yellow pine, sometimes we call it. Not so much ponderosa. We have Jeffrey here, which is very similar species, but and you would probably not be able to tell the difference unless you smell it or feel the cones. Those are good ways to identify ponderosa versus Jeffrey. But if you're in the Los Padres, 9 times out of 10, it's Jeffrey pine instead of ponderosa pine. We also have mixed conifer forests, generally at the higher elevations. This is on Pine Mountain, so I will be talking about this quite a bit later. But mixed conifer, we're talking Jeffrey pine, sugar pine, white fir, incense cedar. All of these species sort of coming together and intermixing, and they make for a wonderful forest to walk through and explore. We even have redwood in the Los Padres. We actually have the southernmost stands, naturally occurring stands of redwood up in the Big Sur area. So if you go to the very south end of the National Forest in the Monterey Ranger District, you will find some of these stands in the canyons, sort of between chaparral. It's really fascinating, and it's unlike a lot of other places where you find redwoods naturally occurring in California. So that's pretty cool. This is an area up in the Ventana Wilderness. So these are all redwoods that you see for the most part, and there's a lot of really cool ceanothus and some other shrubs down in here as well. And last but not least, we have badlands. So if you're not familiar with badlands, they're not bad. They're great. They're good lands. They're just different, and people couldn't really graze them or get a lot of value out of them historically, and so they called them badlands. Perhaps we should have a different outlook on them now. I mean, they're really interesting ecosystems. They're really, it refers to the geology that's going on here, and highly erosive. There's not a lot of vegetation. It's extremely dry, but the ecosystem out here is really interesting, and it's very desert-like, and it's more like what you would find in places like Utah. And again, we have this weird little island of these in the Los Padres, and we're quite lucky to have that. So all of these different ecosystems and places all sort of come together in this one area, this region, and it's the Los Padres National Forest. So we're extremely fortunate to get to live here and get to explore this place. And it's one of the reasons why Los Padres Forest Watch, our organization, exists, is we want to try to protect this massive piece of public land and some other public lands nearby, And so we've been around since 2004 working to protect this place. And the reason we have to protect it, you know, a lot of people ask, like, well, isn't it already protected? It's a national forest, right? I mean, it's designated public land. But I hopefully, if you've been paying attention over the last 4 years, just because something is designated public land does not mean it's safe. In fact, we've seen under the Trump administration, we've seen national monuments shrunken. I mean, they've actually undesignated large swaths of a couple national monuments like Bears Ears. And so no public land is really truly safe, is what we're finding out. But national forests, even more so, they're not like national parks. They're not protected in the same way. Again, they have that multi-use mandate, and a lot of different activities can happen in national forests that you would never see in a national park. For instance, drilling. This is something we've been fighting for the last 16 years since our inception. You know, a lot of the reason why we even started was to really push back on some big plans to try to increase the amount of drilling in the Los Padres. The Los Padres National Forest is the only national forest in the state of California that actually has active oil drilling on public land. I mean, it's not just on private land within the boundary, it's on public land as well. So it's actually permitted through the Forest Service. You know, these are private companies that are, you know, profiting off of this public land from drilling, you know, for oil. And there have been attempts to try to do more fracking as well, but we've luckily been able to stop that over the last you know, 10 plus years. But you can see there's this area, especially most of this oil drilling in the Los Padres occurs in Ventura County, and it mostly occurs right here in the Sespe oil field. So you can see there's hundreds of wells here that are, there's some are on private land within the forest boundaries, some are on actual public land and are leased by the Forest Service to private companies. But you know, they're adjacent, they're right along streams, they're immediately adjacent to the Sespe Condor Sanctuary, they're right next to the Sespe Wilderness area, they're next to the Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge, and it's a real ongoing threat. If you actually go and look at this area, this is a string of wells here that are actually on public land within the Los Padres National Forest here. And so you can see there's all these roads that have been built. There's all these oil pads, and here's all the pump jacks here. And we've had to do a lot of work to try to get these oil companies to do simple things like install anti-perching devices on the pump jacks, just to keep California condors from perching on these places. You know, these are dangerous areas with heavy, you know, machinery, and there's a lot of micro trash on these sites that the condors are attracted to. And so we've been fighting for many, many years to try to improve this situation and try to keep new drilling from occurring. And we're still battling these like big proposals and these big efforts to increase this type of extractive activity. The Trump administration just recently announced that they were going to be basically deregulating oil drilling on national forests. So they're gonna roll back some of the protections that we already have because of environmental laws that are already in the books. They're basically going to change how the agency deals with those laws and how they go through the permitting process. And so we've been pushing back on that, and hopefully that doesn't go through or can be overturned by, you know, a future administration. So it's just one of the many things that we're sort of dealing with here in the Los Padres National Forest that's pretty unique. The other thing that we've been working on for, gosh, since 2005 is target shooting. So we've been tracking these target shooting sites all across the national forest. There are like 150 of them, that 145 of them which are not designated, and 148 of which are not managed. So these are just little sites that people have gone out and they take trash and they shoot it up and then they leave it usually. They are all over the national forest. The agency actually developed a land management plan back in 2005 and said, you know, we're going to crack down on this. We're going to prohibit target shooting outside of just a few designated sites. But then they never actually did that. They never enforced it. Other national forests in Southern California did. And so we have been pushing them for years and years to do something about this, to put up you know, signage, to do more patrolling in these areas, to actually write citations for people that are breaking you know, the law here. It's not just that they're target shooting, they're also littering, they're leaving all of this trash. Often it's toxic waste. You know, we find TVs and all sorts of weird electronics and appliances that are shot up in these areas. And they're dangerous for, you know, for wildlife and for soil and water quality as well. And so we've actually had to go to court over this, and we're working our way through that, through this lawsuit, and hopefully, you know, we're going to have a good outcome on this. But it's been a long time in the making, and it's just been really frustrating. But, you know, one of the things that worries me about these sites is all the lead. You know, so this is just from one morning of collecting lead. This was just a little snippet of, I think, about 25 pounds that we collected at this site, just pure, you know, lead ammunition. All throughout the site, and you could just go and find it's literally just sitting on the soil. We'd often find it in creeks that are, you know, in these target shooting sites or right next to them. And these lead bullets, you know, they're over time they're breaking apart, they're fragmenting, and they're you know, starting to get into the waterways, into soil. And this really does pose a risk in a lot of different ways. You know, this is a toxic source of toxic pollution here. And we've collected, I mean, one site we collected, I think, 60 pounds of lead just in a single day, and we haven't finished that site. So we're going to be doing a lot of that this coming year. We actually have a grant to go out and to work on some of these sites in the Santa Barbara front country. And just so you know, you might be thinking, oh, well, good thing we have that lead ammunition ban that just went into effect in California. And that is great. We're excited about that. It only applies to hunting, though. It does not apply to target shooting. So you can still go out and use lead ammo for target shooting. You're not going to get in trouble for that. So we don't expect that this is necessarily going to let up. We hopefully that lead ammo ban sort of changes the you know, what product availability there is in California. So maybe it'll shift it more to copper or brass, or, you know, whatever the non-lead alternatives are. But really, it's we expect to keep seeing this. And right now we have a legacy of decades and decades of target shooting at some of these sites that we have to go and try to clean up. And Deborah asked, isn't lead the #1 source of mortality for condors? And yes, it is. That is, lead poisoning is the #1 source of mortality still for condors. Most of that comes from because of hunting. It usually has to do with lead contamination of carcasses. You know, so if someone may shoot an animal and then they can't find it, or they leave it, maybe they just take the antlers, you know, if it's a buck. I mean, there's all sorts of weird things that people do, and then the condors can maybe get to that carcass, and that's the way that they ingest lead. That's a big issue. But they also ingest micro trash, especially at these target shooting sites, and so that's one of the reasons why we're so concerned about these as well. There's also off-road vehicle use. There are plenty of designated places in the Los Padres National Forest to go and ride motorcycles, ATVs. That's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is like these trails that have just been created over time from off-road use, like designated trails and roads. And so we see areas like this that will just start to pop up, and you'll see this like maze of different trails, and this is really causing a lot of damage in these areas. There's a lot of vegetation that is just being removed. This is habitat fragmentation here. A lot of this is happening right next to a wild and scenic river here, Pyro Creek. You know, there's just a lot of damage going on, and so we do what we can to try to you know, prevent that from happening. We've worked on projects to try to install. You know, we've looked at where should signage be installed, or barriers, you know, for people so they can't get off the road. But it's a real ongoing issue, especially in these types of ecosystems that are often slow growing and are quite sensitive. And so this is one area in the Los Padres over by a campground called Gold Hill Campground. A really popular area, as you can see. And it's just unfortunate that there's so much damage that's being caused when we have plenty of designated trails systems in the Los Padres for off-road vehicles like ATVs and motorcycles. I mean, this is someone riding a motorcycle in a recovering burned area. Now this wasn't recovering very well because it was actually in a fuel break, and it was like he's probably riding in a dozer line that you can't really see, but still causing erosion in these areas that are pretty sensitive right after a fire. We see this all the time, and we've been working on it for several years, but it's a really difficult issue to address. And then sort of the big one that has come up more recently, and this is the one I'll talk the most about, is logging. Now, you may remember that I mentioned earlier there's not a lot of forest in the Los Padres National Forest. It's mostly shrubland, and you can't really log shrubs. There's just there's not a lot of timber value in shrubs, as you might guess. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be in the future because of biomass incineration, and that is a concern of ours, is that we'll increasingly see some of these types of projects target chaparral because it's an easy biomass product. But for the most part, we have not had to deal with logging issues in the Los Padres for long before we as an organization existed. It has just not been a timber producing national forest. But over the last just few years, so starting in 2018, we started seeing these proposals coming out very suddenly, very quickly, and skirting the normal environmental review process. This is one that came out in 2018. This is Takuya Ridge, this is Fraser Park, if you're familiar with that. This is Mount Pinos, would be like right here. And this is an area where there's a lot of condor activity. There's a lot of roosting. That's what all these yellow symbols here are. And the agency proposed this 12-mile long logging project along this ridge line where you happen to also have a lot of nice Jeffrey pine and some other mixed conifer. And so we're actually still in court over this because the agency did end up approving it, and they approved it without preparing an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. They said it would be a commercial logging project. And that's really a concern. That was a concerning thing to us. They also approved another project adjacent to it. So there's another, you can't see it on this map, but it's right here, this area. So they approved those. They proposed them at the exact same time and approved them within months of each other. So we're still fighting both of those in court because, again, both of them did not go through the proper environmental review process, and we are really concerned about the damage that can be done from these activities. Now, Pine Mountain is the latest one. Now, Bruce mentioned earlier that it was proposed this summer. It was proposed at the end of May. So it was right, we're in the middle of the pandemic, which I say that as if we're not still in the middle of the pandemic. I think we're in a worse place than we might have been then. But, we're in this pandemic. It was right when we started seeing all these like nationwide protests. There was civil unrest. There was an economic crisis happening. And the agency just sort of quietly issued this proposal and said, oh yeah, we're going to do this little logging project on 755 acres of Pine Mountain of all places. Talk about one of the most popular destinations in the southern Los Padres National Forest. This is a recreation, hotspot. A lot of people go there to climb, go there to hike, camp, and it's also spiritually important. It's culturally important to different Chumash groups. This is their ancestral land, and this project gets proposed, and the agency says, and we're going to use a categorical exclusion, so we don't actually have to do an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. And that was really frustrating to see the third project in a row come out like that, and to be so, I guess, blatant, with what they were proposing and where they were proposing it, and without really reaching out to groups beforehand to try to see what issues there might be about this. And so again, it's 755 acres. They would remove live and dead trees with heavy equipment, feller bunchers, things like that, or with chainsaws. They have some diameter limits, but I'm going to talk in a second about why those are problematic. And then about 300 acres of the area is actually chaparral, and it would be removed with mastication, some type of clearing activity. Usually it's mastication, which I'll show you an example of that later. And the agency has repeatedly said timber sales on the table, commercial logging. This is can be a commercial logging project, especially if they find a company that's interested. And so that is a major concern to us. So here is the actual project area. This is a map that we made. So you can see it kind of hugs the top of the ridge line. Now, the reason for that is that it's too steep over here, and there's not any trees over in this area. Most of the forest is on top of the ridge or on the north slope here. But a lot of this is the Sespe Wilderness. It's right, along the boundary. And if you try to do a project like this in a wilderness area, it's an automatic. You have to go to usually an environmental impact statement, which is the most stringent level of environmental review. So it really seemed like the agency was just trying to avoid that by the way they drew their boundary. They stayed out of the wilderness. Although about 34% of the area is in proposed wilderness. So this is in areas that are proposed and have actually been approved by the House of Representatives already to be added to the CESP wilderness, still awaiting a vote in the Senate, but could very well become law and would basically expand the CESP wilderness. But again, you can see there's trailheads, there's campgrounds, there's trails. This is a really unique place when we actually think about the ecology of this area. This is the highest diversity of coniferous species in Ventura County occur here. It's really, really special and it's really unique. And a lot of people feel very passionately about it. And so we were pretty concerned about this. And I think Ventura Audubon Society was rightfully concerned as well, and ended up signing on to our sign-on letter with over 70 other organizations that were also concerned about this. And one of the big concerns that we have, especially one that I have as someone who does a lot of this type of work and spends a lot of time out in these forested ecosystems and has done a lot of literature review on what's normal, what's not normal for forests, what are they supposed to look like, how do they look historically, things like that. And one of the red flags that I saw was that the agency was saying, oh, well, we have a 24-inch diameter limit, so we're only going to be removing smaller trees. So what I took that to mean was that they're calling a 23.9-inch tree a small tree. Just to give you an idea, this is a 23.5-inch diameter tree. This is me. I'm like 5'10". So you can see this is not what I would call a small tree. It's more like a mid to large tree, especially for this area. And a lot of these, even this size tree is, it can be 100 plus years old. And this is really one of the target sizes. This is when you look at their data. Well, actually, they haven't shared their data with us, and they actually just denied a FOIA request to get their tree stand data, which has been quite frustrating. But the sort of summary, tables that they've provided have indicated that this is really the size tree that they want to get. And one of the reasons is from a sawmill perspective, this is a very easy saw timber tree. It's usually young enough that it's straight. It's not too old that it's gotten hit by lightning so many times or it's all gnarled. So this is a nice straight tree, really good for saw timber. So we think it's one of the reasons why they're after this particular size. Now that 24-inch limit is not really a true limit though, because they also in their proposal said, well, we can also remove anything over 24 inches up to 64 inches in diameter, which if we do the math, which is difficult, I have trouble with this simple math. But it is a little over 5 feet in diameter. So think about that. Those trees can be removed for safety reasons or if they're impacted by dwarf mistletoe. Now, I'll tell you why this is problematic. Safety reasons is not defined. We have no idea what they mean by this. Do they think is a tree an imminent threat, like it's going to fall on people? We often see this in the final decision documents for other types of other similar projects. We see that it's often says safety and operability. So it sometimes can be used as, well, we can't get our equipment through this area because of this tree, so we'll have to remove this tree, even though it's over the 24-inch limit. So this is the exception that they would be able to use for that. The other thing is the impacted by dwarf mistletoe. Now that's a major problem as well. And just to give you a sense of size, this is a 53-inch tree. So this is still not even close to the limit, the max limit here. Now the dwarf mistletoe thing is perplexing. It's not so perplexing when you start to really think about it, but it's frustrating is I guess the word I keep coming back to. This is a native, so there are several different native species of dwarf mistletoe. We have one primarily that grows in our area and mostly grows on Jeffrey pine. And this is it. So you can see the little clumps here. This is a really important species for overall forest health. There have been studies that have looked at this and have found that the presence of dwarf mistletoe is important for bird species richness and abundance in these types of forest. The two are actually correlated often. So these can serve as an important, they can serve several different important functions, but one of them is actually that over time they can kill a tree. They don't always kill a tree. The parasites don't always kill their host. It's sometimes not great practice to kill your host, but they sometimes can. And that can help naturally thin forest out. And this is a natural thinning process. And this is one of those agents, natural agents of mortality. And so it's one of those things that we actually want in the forest because it helps maintain balance. But the agency is now saying any tree, if it's over 24 inches, but it has dwarf mistletoe, we can remove that. And we've seen this, historically in other national forests. This is often it's an excuse to remove larger trees. And I'm not going to go deep on the science or anything here, but it is really quite frustrating that this is still something that the agency is using to try to justify removing certain trees. And a lot of trees up in this area have some amount of dwarf mistletoe, which would make them subject to removal through this stipulation. So when I said earlier that the agency is doing this under a categorical exclusion, what that means is they would normally have to prepare an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement as required by the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. But many, many years ago, after NEPA was signed into law, I think a lot of different groups, a lot of agencies all came together and said, okay, there are plenty of activities that really just don't need to have an environmental assessment. You shouldn't have to do an environmental assessment for painting the ranger station or fixing the bathroom, fixing a fence or something like that. And so that's where categorical exclusions sort of came about. Was these would be ways that would allow the agency to just say, this is not an activity that is going to cause major environmental damage. And again, it was for really minor things. Over time, as you might imagine, that sort of opened the floodgates and it allowed the agency and Congress, administrations to start to tinker with that. And they started to create new categorical exclusions and expand existing ones. And so now what we have are these giant loopholes, basically, for agencies like the Forest Service to avoid doing an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, even though they're proposing to do commercial logging on 755 acres of land. And so what happens when a categorical exclusion is used is the public only gets one comment period. So the agency would notify, puts out a scoping notice is what that's called. It's not like they send that to everybody. They just send that to people that they know would be interested, which includes like Forest Watch. And so then we alert the public. And so we only get one comment period with a categorical exclusion. Usually it's 30 days. Luckily, we got an extended one this time because some members of Congress pushed for one for an extended comment extension. And the thing that really bothers me about categorical exclusions for these types of projects is that the agency doesn't actually have to respond to comments. So when you write a comment and you say, here are my concerns, and here's what I would like for you to address. If the agency was doing an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, they have in their sort of final, usually in their draft document and in their final document, they'll have a section where they actually address comments. And that's an important part of this process. It basically helps increase transparency and let us know that the agency was taking us seriously or wasn't taking us seriously. But they don't have to do that in this situation. And in fact, after the comment period's over, the next step, there's only one next step. There's no draft decision, anything like that. It's just a decision memo is what it's called, is issued, and that's it. And then the project goes forward. What that means is that there's no objection process, which is what you normally get with a category or with an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, which would mean like if we had an issue with their final decision, we could have this mediation and try to come up with solutions. Okay, we can maybe agree on let's do this instead of this, and we've been able to do that effectively and avoid having to go to court over what we consider war damaging projects. With the categorical exclusion, you just don't get that. And so the only way to challenge a project after this decision has been issued is to go to court. And that's what we had to do with those last two logging projects that I mentioned earlier. So it's very frustrating. It cuts the public out, and it really just increases the likelihood of litigation, which nobody wants. It always costs us money and time to do litigation, and it's a very frustrating ordeal to go through. But we do it because that's our only recourse, and we've exhausted all other options. The categorical exclusion just doesn't give you very many options. So the big question is, why are they doing this and how are they justifying it? So the why is probably tied in with some commercial timber perspectives, right? There's this particular administration especially has been really trying to push increasing timber extraction in national forest. And the justification that the agency is using is that they're saying that this project will actually mitigate wildfire. It will help reduce the chances of catastrophic fire in the future. And so my question is, will that actually happen if they do this project as they're planning? And first, I need you to understand about fire. I need to explain what is normal, what is catastrophic fire, what's good fire, bad fire. You know, these are the kind of words we hear a lot, but what do any of those mean? And so let's just talk about conifer forests, specifically mixed conifer forests, which is the majority of what we have up on Pine Mountain. There are a lot of different forest types in California. You've got redwood forest, you've got lodgepole pine forest, you've got mixed conifer forests. They all have different fire regimes, natural fire regimes. Just, you know, sometimes they're similar, but they're often different, sometimes in important ways. But with mixed conifer forest and with Jeffrey pine forest too, what we know from a pretty big pile of historical and ecological and evolutionary evidence is that mixed severity fire is the norm. What that means is when a fire burns, it burns in a sort of a patchwork. It leaves behind this mosaic of what you might consider different levels of severity. And let me explain this. So you can see this area, this all burned in the same fire. This was the rim fire back in 2013 in the Sierra Nevada. This was right on the edge of Yosemite and the Stanislaus National Forest. So Yosemite National Park is right up here, and this is the Stanislaus National Forest. Now, this was a 252,000 acre fire. It was the biggest in the Sierra at the time. And you might, you know, if you read any media articles or any reports, if you listen to the Forest Service, it would sound like the entire 250,000 acres was like completely lost forever. You know, the forest was completely destroyed, all the trees were killed, and it was never going to grow back. The reality is that it burned exactly the way we expect it to, especially with these large fires, and it's mixed severity fire. So there are huge swaths that burn at low severity. And when I say severity, that means how many trees are actually killed. Low severity means there's less than 25% tree mortality. There's areas that are moderate severity, which is 25 to 75% tree mortality. Often, like, you know, 50% of the trees will die. And then there's high severity. This is where you get more than 75% tree mortality. And you can see it forms this patchwork. It's never, a fire never burns all just one way. You know, any fire in the Sierra Nevada, any fire this year, the biggest fires of this year, the August complex, 1 million+ acres, that will be mostly low and moderate severity, just judging by the way, how fast it's been progressing. It was moving, it was just kind of creeping along for months, which is a pretty good indication that it's low, moderate severity. High severity is really driven by very difficult to understand factors, mostly related to like weather, microclimate, things that happen the day that the fire is burning in that area. It can just very seemingly randomly burn high severity in one area, but in the exact same type of forest, same density, maybe it's even more dense next door, you know, it burns at low severity. And it's really hard to understand why. And that's a lot of science is, you know, still going into why does it burn this way or that way. But the point here is that this sort of patchwork is completely normal. This mixed severity fire regime is normal. And it's actually quite crucial to long-term stability of forest and biodiversity. So this high severity component is not unusual. This is what people usually talk about when they talk about catastrophic fire, like you got most of the trees in an area are killed. The problem with that is that fire is catastrophic when it destroys homes, it kills people. When it does that, it's catastrophic, and it's obviously it's a tragedy. But when it burns ecosystems, particularly in forests, it's usually not catastrophic, and it's often it's a completely normal part of that ecosystem's fire ecology. So I'm going to focus on this high severity component for a minute because this is really important to understand this. And I think as people who are interested in birds, you should really be interested in this because there is nowhere more interesting from a birding perspective than a high severity fire patch in a mixed conifer forest. It is simply one of the most fascinating places you will ever visit in terms of what kind of birds you're going to see. So I'm gonna dive in here on this rimfire. And I know it may feel like I'm getting away from Pine Mountain. I'm gonna come back to it. Don't worry. I got to go on these little tangents because it's important for it to all sort of come together in your mind. Hopefully that is the end result. And just so you know, the rimfire, when you total up all the high severity patches, it was about 19% high severity in total. 250,000 acres, about 19%. Vast majority low to moderate severity. If you read any news article from the time, you would never, ever guess that. You would think that it was just the biggest conflagration, as they used to say a lot more often in old newspaper articles, a word that I like to try to bring back every now and then. You know, it was huge, and it burned it killed every single tree out there, and it killed all the wildlife, and the forest is never going to go back. That is simply not the case. And let me just show you an area that was high severity. Again, this is a patch of high severity. This is how it always is. They're surrounded by low, moderate severity. A lot of times they have inclusions, what we call inclusions of moderate or low severity. And this is really important. These surviving trees will serve as seed sources for regrowth in these areas. So, let me just say, this area, I'm showing you this Google Earth image, but I was just there a few weeks ago in this exact spot. I was right here on this road and walked into this area. So I'm going to show you what it looks like 7 years later. This is what it looks like. This is all natural regeneration. Nobody has come in here and done any planting. Fortunately, nobody has done any salvage logging and removed all the snags. So this is what we call an intact snag forest, which is a very important thing from a birding perspective. But what I want you to see here is look at all these. This is ponderosa pine. There's white fir. There's a sugar pine. It looks like here. There's Douglas fir and incense cedar, which you can't see in this photo. But some of these, I mean, some of these were 12 feet tall ponderosa pines. The regeneration is just astounding. And this occurred again. Think about when the fire happened, 2013. That was a beginning / kind of getting into the peak of that really serious drought we just got out of, and we still have all this regeneration over the 7 years since, which is pretty remarkable in my book. Now, you see some shrubs here too. This is all deer brush. This is a type of ceanothus. It's a nitrogen fixer. So it's really important in these high severity areas because it's putting nitrogen back in the soil, which is important for the trees to be able to grow. And in the meantime, there's just this amazing diversity of plants. You've got some manzanita, you've got deer brush, you've got gooseberry, wild currant, you've got all these different saplings coming up, wildflowers. This is obviously in the fall, so you're not really seeing the wildflowers here. There's bear clover, you can't really see it, but it's down here. All of that is highly attractant to various bird species that are coming in there. They're chasing the pollinators that are chasing the wildflowers. You know, the birds come in. Some of them, like woodpeckers, are coming in for the the wood boring beetles that come in after the fire, and they come and colonize the snags. That attracts the woodpeckers. The woodpeckers make nest cavities. Those nest cavities are used by the nuthatches later. The raptors come in to eat the nuthatches. There's all this amazing, amazing stuff happening. You know, the snags fall over, they create logs. That's great habitat for chipmunks. The chipmunks attract more raptors and owls. I can go on and on. In fact, I could give you a 3-hour presentation just on this because I find it so incredibly fascinating. And it's probably the greatest story that hasn't really been told very well about fire in California. And it's the one thing that I would venture a guess is probably the most misunderstood aspect of fire in California as well. Here's another area that was high severity. You can see there's a bunch of willow growing in here, all these ponderosa pines. So it's not a catastrophe when this happens. There is a lot of debate about forest management and how to try to prevent this from happening. The problem with all of that is it's all so very, very focused on trying to force these ecosystems into a type of fire regime that's not really natural for them. They're not supposed to just be low severity fire that occurs every 10 years. It's supposed to be naturally variable with these patches of high severity fire in these types of forests. So we have tons and tons of research that supports all of this. There are whole books that have been written about this. Another term for this is pyrodiversity. Mixed severity fire creates pyrodiversity, and that begets biodiversity. And so I encourage you, if you're interested, reach out to me, and I am happy to share some of these articles. I can send you some really great media articles that would be good to read. There's a really good book on this that I find very helpful to sort of walk through this whole process. But again, there's a lot of science, and a lot of this has come out over just the last couple of decades. So it's relatively new to some people, but it is incredibly important for long-term viability of our forest. And what's so cool about this is that there are all these studies that have found that there are certain bird species that you only find in high severity fire patches, or you only find them in moderate severity fire patches. So, you know, low severity fire is great for western tanagers, but high severity fire is great for hairy woodpeckers. Dark-eyed juncos seem to prefer moderate severity fire. So it's important to have this diversity of fire. And whenever we see projects that their whole goal is to try to prevent high severity fire from occurring at all, the goal is to try to make it a low severity fire system. Not only is it usually ineffective and doesn't work, but if it were to work, it would actually be problematic from a biodiversity standpoint. And here's that same area I showed initially, and this is a woodpecker nest cavity here, and you see these and all these broken top snags. Everywhere you walk, where these are intact snag forests, you see all these nest cavities, and it's fascinating. And a lot of these are black-backed woodpeckers, which is a pretty elusive species that you only find in these high severity fire patches for the most part. So it's really a really cool thing to look into, and I really encourage you to try to learn more about it, especially from a birding perspective. Here's one other area I'll show you. This is again in October. You've got all this golden fleece blooming in October. None of this would be here in this mature forest. If you know, before the fire, you would not have found any golden fleece. This came in after the fire. You can still see all this conifer regeneration happening naturally. The black oaks are resprouting, and so there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot to love about these areas. So don't think of them as a loss. You know, think of them as new habitat being created. And when we go back to Pine Mountain, one of the reasons I'm telling you all this, especially about the mixed severity component, is that the Forest Service is essentially telling the public that the next time an area burns on Pine Mountain, it's going to be high severity because the forest is too dense. And what they have neglected to actually mention in their proposal or to analyze in any detail is there is a great case study on Pine Mountain from just a few years ago, the Pine Fire from 2016. Now, this is about a mile east of the project area. This is in the Sespe Wilderness. It's in an unmanaged area. It's not been thinned. It hasn't burned. It hadn't burned since at least 1932, longer in some areas. And yet the fire really didn't do a whole lot. I mean, it was a couple thousand acres. And when we look at just the high severity patches, that's what all these are, what we see is that of the 800 plus acres of mixed conifer forest that burned, only about 4% of that was high severity. So really, even the high severity component of this was pretty small. It was about 16% total, but a lot of that was chaparral and oak woodland, which is canyon live oak woodland, which is pretty normal for those ecosystems. So I would, point to this fire as this is what maybe we should expect for future fires on Pine Mountain. That's not to say that there couldn't be a big fire that occurs under an extreme wind event, but it's exactly those kind of conditions where a project like Pine Mountain logging is not going to help, and it may actually hurt it, from a fire fighting perspective or from a fire severity perspective. And just as an example of that, this is a place up in the Plumas National Forest that is it's ponderosa pine. It's kind of mixed conifer forest, sort of similar to what you might find on Pine Mountain. It's up in Northern California. It's a little bit different, but same general concept, same fire regime. And this is actually a pretty naturally low density forest. I've seen natural forests that are 10 times denser than this. I mean, this is like nothing, but the agency basically came in and said, the forest is too dense. We've got to go in and do a forest health project. They ended up doing a logging project. They used very, very similar targets and size limits to what we're seeing in the Pine Mountain project. Same process, categorical exclusion, no environmental assessment, environmental impact statement. And they used heavy equipment, and just, this is what it looked like right before. And this is what it looked like toward the end of the project. So you can see there's still logs on the ground that they've piled up here on these landings. There's all these skid trails, all these little logging roads essentially, and they drastically reduced the density of this forest. Now, there's a lot of different things that are wrong with this. One, they've just made this, a surefire way to increase invasive grasses and other plants in this area. They've, just by all the soil disturbance, bringing in heavy equipment, it's a great way to introduce cheatgrass or spread cheatgrass, which is a highly flammable invasive grass, into these forested areas. They've really probably set back a lot of the ability for some of the native plants to be able to recover because of all the soil disturbance and soil compaction in some places. And then the other thing is that they've just opened this forest up so that the wind buffering effect that the forest had from any small trees or shrubs that were there, that's now gone. And so when a fire does come through here, there's a good chance that the wind is actually going to pick up as it moves through this area, which can often instigate that higher severity component. So if the goal is to reduce high severity fire, this can sometimes be counterproductive. And it can also be counterproductive from an ignition standpoint, because it's a great way to spread highly flammable invasive plants in these areas, which are easily ignitable. And again, these projects usually just don't even work anyway. The Creek Fire, huge fire in the Sierra Nevada, probably out by now because of the weather change that's happened. But when the first few days, when it blew up back in September, it went right through these types of projects. All this orange and purple and yellow, all of these are thinning projects, logging projects, prescribed fire, things like that. And none of it stopped the fire as it raced north, and then eventually into some wilderness areas where it dramatically slowed down. And you can see, it's hard to tell from this. This is a progression map, but basically these, the fact that you see all this, like this really sharp change from these bluer colors to these redder colors, means that it basically just started creeping along as it got into these wilderness areas. So again, these projects often do a lot of damage and they don't work very well. Now, in the chaparral component, it's important to understand that there is no mixed severity fire aspect to this. It's large, intense, but infrequent. High severity fires are the norm. So you expect to find a whole area that is just kind of incinerated, and that's normal. It's only normal at 30 to 150 plus year intervals. Anything shorter than that, it's not normal, and that's where you can lose a lot of native species. But this, again, is something that we would expect to see in chaparral, like on Pine Mountain. And what you see after a fire there is, in this ecosystem, is something like this. It may look terrible, it may look dramatic, but this is completely normal. It's exactly what we want to see. It means that the fire burned nice and hot, which is good for stimulating seed germination and getting rid of those non-native plant seeds that might have been there. And it doesn't take long for you to get a lot of regrowth happening in these areas. So this is an area I've been documenting over by Santa Barbara for the last year. And this is 1 month after the fire, all the way to 6 months. And so there's just this incredible amount of growth that happens just in the first 6 months, the first spring especially. And I want to show you some of that a little bit more. So just to give you a perspective on this, here's another place. This is really close to what I just showed you. This is all burned toyon, which can resprout actually. So these all resprouted since this fire back in November last year. This is a week after the fire. This is about 5 months after the fire. So it's a pretty amazing juxtaposition, and it only gets better from here. If we look at the Thomas Fire, I think this is a great example of a lot of this. Most of the Thomas Fire was chaparral, especially in the Los Padres National Forest. And so a lot of what I just showed you played out over the last 3 years and is continuing to play out in these places that we all sort of explore and love in the Los Padres. So here's the Thomas Fire perimeter, and it wasn't really anything new in terms of the areas that were burning. We've seen fire after fire after fire after fire after fire all through this area. Some of the fires are occurring too frequently, especially like closer to Ventura. In these areas, we are getting a little bit of type conversion. A lot of that was also caused by historic grazing, but that is a concern there. But in a lot of these other places, the fire return interval, it's a little bit shorter than I would like, but it's still, technically, it's not really high risk for type conversion yet. Now, if we get another fire in the next few years in these areas, that could be a major issue. But I want to show you some of the regrowth that has happened. So this is 18 months after the fire. And you can imagine that right after the fire, it was all that sort of blackened landscape, what people often call moonscapes. It's not a moonscape. There's no vegetation on the moon. And a lot of what you see in the moonscape of the chaparral post-fire is actually still living plants. They're just underground. So all their root systems are fine and they're going to resprout. Some species can't resprout. They come up from seed, like all this yellow you see here. This is all deerweed. It's a nitrogen fixing species. It all came up from seed after the fire. And it really makes for an incredible display of wildflowers. Same with the golden eardrops, a really cool fire following species. You can see it again here growing along with poodle log bush, which it can cause a rash. So I don't recommend necessarily like walking through it, but admire it from afar. You know, all of these wildflowers that come up after these fires are attracting pollinators, which are in turn attracting birds. So even, you know, these areas, you don't have to go up to the rimfire and into the snag forest to see a lot of great birding activity. You can see a lot of birds, unique birds here in these post-fire areas near Ventura. Here's an area, this is 2 months after the fire along a creek right off Highway 33. And you can see there's a lot of oaks that look like they died, some sycamores that maybe look dead. All the shrubs look toast. And of course, 25 months after the fire, so just a little over 2 years after the fire, most of those oaks survived. I'd say probably all of them in this area were able to resprout from their branches, or they were able to resprout from their base. The sycamores, that's what's turning yellow here, they survived. They're resprouting here in the background. All the shrubs here have either they've resprouted or they're coming up from seed. There's a lot of ceanothus seedlings here you can't see. But this is exactly what we expect, and it's a pretty amazing and beautiful process to watch unfold. Here's another area that I was just in a few weeks ago, or really just a couple weeks ago, beginning of this month, in Tillahaw Canyon. Again, this coast live oak looks like it was just completely burned away, gone forever, and resprouted from its branches. This is called epicormic sprouting. It's a really fascinating ability that these oaks have. All the sycamores here in the background, they've resprouted. So there's just, so much growth. You can see it up here in the background too, that has occurred just over the last few years since the Thomas Fire burned back in late 2017. If you go out there right now and, in this kind of fall season, you may see a lot of this like orangish color stuff that is draping all these shrub skeletons and some of the living shrubs. That's fine. That's all native morning glory. It's just sort of died back for the summer. And it will come back to life here as soon as we get some more rain. You'll start seeing some leaves come out. And then in the spring, you'll see a bunch of really beautiful big white flowers on these vines. So this is also a normal and I think quite beautiful scene of regrowth in the Thomas Fire area. One place that I really want to show you, just because it's so cool, is the Dry Lakes Ridge area. So this is what it looked like about 9 months before the fire, and this is what it looked like about 14 months after the fire. So you can see a lot of the tree, there were a lot of oaks here that burned up. There's all the shrubs sort of burned up, but most of these have resprouted. A lot of this is a type of manzanita that can resprout. These basins here, these are not actually dry lakes. They're just geological depressions on this ridgetop. Most of what this was before the fire was Great Basin sagebrush, which was very unusual. It actually was a reason why this was a specially designated botanical area. There's also some ponderosa pine, which is pretty unusual too for this area. And so it doesn't look so great. And I was a little worried about this when I first went out there 14 months after the fire. I was really excited to see all this regrowth. I was like, what is going on with this basin? I came back 4 months later in the spring, and it was just a completely different world. It was like I entered a Dr. Seuss book. I mean, it was just so bizarre, but awesome. I mean, it was really, really cool to see. All this is poodle dog bush. Lovely to see. I would not touch it. Don't recommend it. It can give you a rash. Good chunk of the population is immune to it, but don't risk it. But you can work your way through. There's still a trail, and you can get to these areas. What was so cool was this place that had once been just pure Great Basin sagebrush. It was now all these lupins and cryptantha and all these amazing wildflowers, which I'll show here in a second again. This is all the manzanita coming up, resprouting here, which is really fascinating. And there's also some big cone Douglas fir up there, which is a really cool species of conifer we have here. That was it just had a sort of a low severity fire come through here, which is pretty cool. Again, this is that basin that I was just talking about. This is my girlfriend walking through it before the fire. All of this is just Great Basin sagebrush. There was probably some rabbit brush here and there, but it was like a pure stand of sagebrush, which is sort of bizarre just on its own. Again, 14 months after the fire, it sort of looked like a wasteland, and I was a little bit nervous about it. But 4 months later, it was just so interesting. All of this is like lupin, red ray alpengold, scarlet bugler, cryptantha, milkweeds, just some really wonderful species that I would never have expected to find there, given what it was before the fire. And this is what it looked like again this past spring. It wasn't quite as extravagant because we didn't have quite the same rainy season as we had before in 2019, but still really cool to see. Here's another view. This is kind of looking back the other direction. This is 14 months after the fire, and this is 18 months after the fire. So just a completely different world, and it's really lovely. Now, some people have asked me when I've talked about this in other presentations, they've asked about, oh, how's the sagebrush doing? Oh yeah, here's some of those species up close. They're really cool. Different Mariposa lilies, and this is a really cool one that I just don't see very often in Los Padres. So that was fun to see. And, so people ask about the Great Basin sagebrush, and it's also coming back. It's slow. It's a much slower growing species, and it's usually coming from seed that's brought in from off-site. How exactly that happens, not entirely sure, and I'm a little bit perplexed at how it's able to grow so quickly after the fire. But this is almost 3 years after the fire, and it's coming up pretty well. It's all over that basin, so it will in time sort of reclaim its spot. But in the meantime, there's this really amazing sort of diversity happening with all these wildflowers. Again, this is the poodle dog bush growing among some burned but resprouting oaks. And these attract so many bees, so many different pollinators, which in turn attract sometimes kind of rare species like lazuli buntings. I don't see those very often, but I have seen them abundantly in the Thomas Fire area and in another area that I've been going to a lot that burned near Santa Barbara. So that is a really fun species to see. I didn't have a great lens to capture this, so it's not the best photo of a lazuli bunting that you've probably seen, but one of my favorite birds to find. Just because I got to show you some more bird stuff because it is the Audubon Society. This is a hummingbird nest I found the other day in Matilahaw Canyon on a bush poppy, which is a shrub species that you see come up after a fire. So this is a good sign. I mean, the hummingbirds are back in this area. They're nesting on these sort of transient shrub species, which is pretty cool. Scrub jays, they seem completely unfazed by fire. They come back in. I've seen them like weeks after a fire, where they're already back in, hanging out on the snags. They especially like areas where they can still get into maybe some unburned patches. This is 18 months after the fire. Maybe a underappreciated bird, so it's because it's so common, but still just such a stunning species. I always love seeing them and getting yelled at by them. And this is not the Thomas Fire, but it's another fire near Santa Barbara. I just love this photo. I was pretty excited when I got to take it. This is a California quail. This is one of the sentries, looking out for the covey that are sort of foraging below on a burned ceanothus, greenbark ceanothus snag here, which is actually resprouting. That's what all this is. But man, it really had just such a cool pose. I was pretty excited about that. Now, I know it feels like I just went on this crazy tangent about regrowth and fire and all this stuff, but it's important because, again, when we look at things like the Pine Mountain Project, the Forest Service is proposing this massive project, a lot of which would be removing chaparral with mastication. So we've talked about how all of what they're doing in the forested part can be a problem, but just consider that the chaparral, the 300 acres, is likely going to be masticated, which is essentially taking this big piece of equipment and just shredding it down into mulch, shredding all the shrubs. We have had to fight the agency over when they do this type of activity. Sometimes they do it, they've done it in bird nesting season in the past. So you can imagine all the bush tits and wren tits probably don't like their homes being shredded apart while they're nesting. That's a pretty detrimental issue there. But what also happens is you just don't get the same regrowth here. You don't have fire that's come through and stimulated seed germination. Sometimes this can really mangle the burls that are the sort of kind of right at the base of the shrub that's able to resprout. This can be really problematic, and it can actually lead to what we call type conversion. So this is actually often the purpose of these types of fuel breaks, is to convert it from chaparral to non-native grassland. And that's exactly what you have here along Camino Cielo near Santa Barbara. I love this photo because it has like everything wrong with it. It's the power lines over this road that's got all this like, the road is already kind of its got its own issues. And then there's this giant fuel break running through here. That's pure, almost pure wild oats and invasive grass species and black mustard. And what you can't really tell from this photo, because it's like a year or two after this fire that burned through here called the Whittier Fire, that fire just blew right over this fuel break, and the fuel break just did not stop it at all. Came right over it. Even with firefighter presence on this fuel break, it really didn't do a whole lot until the weather shifted pretty dramatically. But you can see it's burned on both sides in a lot of these places. It's just hard to tell. And so this is what we would expect to see over time at Pine Mountain with this, if this project goes through. And it's exactly what we do not want to see in that place that has been, has avoided this type of activity, at least until recently. Now, one thing that has happened on the ridge is contingency dozer lines during recent wildfires. So this is a dozer line that was for the Thomas Fire, which the Thomas Fire never got anywhere close to Pine Mountain, but they still dozed much of the ridge line, not very wide, which is great, but you can see the dozer actually ripped up a lot of these shrubs, root system and all. So those won't be able to resprout, those won't grow back. Stuff can theoretically come up from seed, but they now have to compete with all this invasive cheatgrass that has moved into this area. And the problem is that already exists, and that's not good to begin with. But the project area would includes all of this, and it would involve masticating the rest of this area. So what you would be doing is masticating this chaparral that has been undisturbed and doesn't have this invasive, grass problem yet. And you would cause all this disturbance that would then allow these invasive grasses to get into these places and start to take over. And all that does is increase the likelihood of an ignition on this ridgeline in the future, because these grasses are incredibly ignitable. They're much more ignitable than any of the chaparral species that we have here. And so these pose a greater risk from a fire perspective in our view. And that's supported by the science on this as well. Now, the agency has even said with the Pine Mountain Project in a previous strategic fuel break assessment document just from 5 years ago, they ranked this really low on the list of priorities. They said it was about 118 out of 163, very low priority. And yet now we are seeing this project being pushed through very suddenly with this commercial logging, component potential. And it's just perplexing, but a lot of it is being driven by agency directives. The administration is doing some things that are really frustrating and unfortunate in terms of trying to increase timber production in these areas. And when we look at these types of fuel breaks, they just don't work very well, particularly under extreme wind conditions. And so this is a pretty big study that took place in the Los Padres National Forest in 2011. And they found that, if the goal is to protect communities, constructing fuel breaks out in remote areas like on Pine Mountain, it's not going to save homes. And we see that time and time again. And so it's a real big concern that we have. Now, you can join this effort still. Audubon Society, the Ventura chapter, has signed on to a letter that we've already submitted to the Forest Service. You can technically still send them a comment. They probably won't respond to it when they issue their decision, but you can let them know that you are upset about this and that you oppose it. We've already had 16,000 people submit opposition comments. You can do this at protectpinemountain.org. We've made it really easy. Cynthia asked how much time there is to comment. Technically, you can comment up until the decision is issued, because it's a wonky way that the categorical exclusion system works. But they have to accept your comment still. Even though the official comment period ended months ago, you can still submit a comment. It may not be taken so seriously, although I've gotten the impression that they're not taking a lot of these opposition comments very seriously anyway. But I do encourage you to comment and let your voice be heard about this. And we don't expect a decision on this project until probably February at the earliest, but it may be later than that. And so, join this sort of chorus of voices. It's not just us, it's 70 other organizations, 60 businesses. There's letters of concern or opposition have been sent by 2 Chumash tribal groups who have been quite vocal on this, 5 elected officials, including a couple of U.S. congressmen and congresswomen. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife sent a very long letter and had some concerns that they would like addressed, and a lot more. So I do encourage you to do this if you get a chance. protectpinemountain.org. And I just real quick before I'm basically done with the presentation, but since I've got you here, we do have an ongoing fundraiser right now, and a lot of that fundraising will go to our efforts to protect Pine Mountain. So this is it's all online. We have the silent auction going on right now. It's very, very easy to participate in. We've got some great products. You can actually buy some of my photos if you like some of the photos that you saw. I've got some cool ones that are for sale in the silent auction. And you can go to sbwild.org. This is our Santa Barbara Wild auction. We'll also have a live auction on Friday that you can participate in virtually, which is pretty cool. So I encourage you to go here, check it out. No harm, no foul. You know, if you don't see anything you like, you don't have to bid. But I'm betting you will see something you want to bid on. So, and it would really greatly help our efforts out. Now, that is my long presentation. Sorry, that was a little longer than I meant for it to be, but there's just so much to talk about always. And, you know, I can't help myself sometimes. I just really want to get in there and talk about birds and wildflowers and biodiversity and stuff. So now, if you've got questions, hopefully you've got questions. I'm willing to stick around as long as Bruce and Cynthia are willing to, you know, host this. I do encourage you to check Forest Watch out on Facebook, on Instagram. I've got an Instagram that's really dedicated just to educational material. I post my photos and put a lot of education out there about chaparral, about bioecology. So you can see a lot of the stuff I showed. I expand upon that in my Instagram. You can go back and check it out. So that's it. That's all I've got. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Brian. Any questions from anyone? You can put them in the chat or unmute yourself. One question I had, Bryant, was, do you think these projects are supported by the local Forest Service people, or is it being pushed down from above?
Well, we've been trying to figure that out, and it's really hard. I mean, there is a serious push by the administration. Like there have been executive orders, there have been internal agency memos, there have been quotas that have been increasing for timber production in the Los Padres National Forest. So it is something that is happening, you know, in a top-down manner. That's all I can really say about it. It's hard to figure out what's going on at the local level, but you know, we're pretty dismayed by what the administration has been doing, and really just trying to get simple information requests through to the administration. Like they've denied FOIA requests on some of this stuff. It's just has not been a transparent process, and some of the local, you know, the agency at the local level has been a part of that, which is unfortunate. And some of that may change if, you know, with the administration change, which is happening. There's some people still in office who think they're not leaving office.
Not going to leave.
But that is happening, and that may shift things, but you know, it's hard to say. So thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Well, thank you, Deborah. There's a couple questions here. Thank you, Deborah, about the post-fire photos. I've got thousands more if you want to look at more. Again, the Instagram, I got a ton of post-fire stuff on there. Cynthia asked, you asked about why did the Pine Mountain sagebrush die off?
The sage, the basin sagebrush. Because was it the fire that killed it off?
Oh, that was on Dry Lakes Ridge.
Right.
Yeah, that was the fire killed it. Yeah, it's just one that it can't resprout, and it doesn't really have that fire cued germination to come back after a fire like a lot of Ceanothus or Manzanita species have. So the fire killed it, and that's why I was saying it's so interesting to see it coming back so quickly, because in like the Great Basin, the actual Great Basin, after a fire in those types of ecosystems, the sagebrush, you know, steppe, the sagebrush scrub, you just don't see sagebrush coming back really, really quickly. It takes a long time. It's a very slow growing ecosystem. So it's really cool to see it already coming back from, it's coming from seed, and I'm trying to figure out where is the seed coming from.
Mhm.
So it's a fun little mystery, but it's great. There's nobody to my knowledge out there spreading sagebrush seed, but I can't discount the possibility. But it's natural regeneration, and it's really pretty lovely. So let's see here. We've got another question. Native willow trees adapted to handle fire by resprouting. Yes, they are vigorous resprouters. They, gosh, I don't think I've ever seen a willow outright just get killed by a fire. I've got some other. I had so many more photos I was going to show you, but then thought they probably don't want to be here till midnight. I've got a lot of photos that I just took in Matilahaw Canyon. If you want a great example of the willow sort of reproduction, go to Matilahaw Canyon, take a hike there. You go right, you're in the Thomas Fire the whole time. And as you look along the creeks, especially along Matilahaw Creek, you will see tons and tons of really vibrant green growth. That's all, for the most part, willow that has resprouted. A lot of times willows also just won't even burn because they're so close to the water, and that there's just a different microclimate there. And so we often see fire just sort of skip over creeks. But when it does burn, it comes back really, really well. I even showed that one photo of there was all that willow in the rim fire area kind of growing among all the conifers coming back up. So it can handle fire quite well. Most of our hardwood species can resprout and are capable of coming back. Alder is one of the examples of a non-sprouting tree, but look for those too. You will see 6 foot saplings, 6 to 10 foot saplings in some of these areas in the Thomas Fire area that are alder saplings. So they may be outright killed by a fire, but they generally come back from seed quite well. The sycamores are extremely vigorous resprouters. I've yet to see just a huge die-off of sycamores from a fire, even though they get completely toasted. So yeah, and the oaks are just sort of they're the prime example of a tree that just does not care about fire. It's gets completely burned up and then resprouts from its branches. It's like, what else you got, man? So yeah, great question.
I have another one if nobody else has one. I'm just wondering if you could speak to just the general flammability of California natives, because I know as far as landscaping your own yard, I believe the fire department came out with a list of recommended plants, and specifically things like, I don't know, I think manzanita and some other things, if there's allegedly too flammable and it's too dangerous.
Yes.
But yeah. So could you speak to that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of chaparral species, a lot of native species, shrubs particularly, that get a bad rap, particularly from the firefighting community, because they can, in chaparral, it produces really high flame lengths. And while that's completely normal for the ecosystem, that isn't usually what firefighters want, which is one of the reasons why we have to be very picky and choosy about what are we wanting to actually fight in terms of fire. Where do we want to try to protect? What do we want to do? Do we want to be putting people out in the backcountry in dangerous situations to protect, areas that are able to regrow very well after fire? Or do we want to try to focus all of our attention on protecting communities right around homes and trying to protect people? And so that's what I advocate for, is that we focus suppression efforts around communities, around homes. I think water drops from helicopters can be really effective and they can be great. But if the wind conditions are really bad, that may not work. So from a flammability perspective, there are some species that are flammable, totally. The thing though is that really applies out in the natural wildland vegetation, the wildland ecosystem. At your own property, if you are irrigating even just a little bit, it drastically reduces flammability, even in species that are considered to be highly flammable. Chamise is a great example. You cannot burn chamise, even though it used to be called greasewood. Chama is the root word for it. It's an old Portuguese word that means flame. I mean, its whole existence has been associated by humans with fire. But if it's irrigated a little bit, it doesn't burn. It doesn't burn in the winter, or in the spring when it's wet. So a little bit of water goes a long way. Now, if you can't irrigate, the thing about your landscaping around your home, and there's a lot of research that's been done on this, is you just want to make sure your shrubs are a little more spaced out. You can clean up some of the dead leaf litter and stuff that's underneath them. I would not have any shrubs right next to your house. I actually recommend to people a 5-foot buffer around your house. Decomposed granite is great, great thing to use there. But in terms of shrubs, I think there are some species that are, they're not super flammable, not like some species. But again, the key is that you want to look at your defensible space around your house, and you want to look at that first 30 feet especially, and you want to space out your shrubs. You don't want to have big giant clumps together. You don't want to be completely surrounded by just like pure chaparral. As much as I want to live among the shrubs, it's not really a wise decision. Now if you have a really fire safe home, like it's got fire safe construction, that can certainly help. But the issue with defensible space is it's about letting firefighters get in there to put water on your house if they can. So spacing out the shrubs is good. You want to retain things like oaks though. You want to retain trees that have that ember screening ability. So oaks around homes are great. You don't want them overhanging the home. You don't want them touching the home, but you don't want to just get rid of all the vegetation around your house, because everything can burn. Everything is flammable under the right conditions. But the research has found that you don't have to do nearly as much vegetation removal around your house to make it safer and to increase the odds that it will survive a fire. I can send you some info on that, on some recommendations what to do. But yeah, I would be careful looking at those like county, those list of plants to avoid, because a lot of them they say to plant like invasive species, ice plant and stuff. Like, well, just because it's less flammable doesn't mean that you should be planting it willy-nilly. It's wreaking havoc, on our native ecosystems nearby.
So my neighborhood burned in the Thomas fire, and we found things like ice plant. If it was old, it was like really kind of stacked up on itself, and it created hot spots that just burned for a week. And
smoldered, right?
Yeah, we were continuously putting them out. And
chaparral plants specifically do not do that. The way they grow, the way that the whole ecosystem is set up is that fire comes through pretty quickly. It doesn't come through too quickly. It's not like grassland where it just like will really blow through. It can actually slow down as it encounters chaparral. But it goes through just quickly enough that it doesn't heat up the soil where it's like killing all the seeds, but it can stimulate a lot of seeds that need high heat. And so, you start bringing in non-native plants that are not part of this fire ecology and this fire climate that we have here, you're going to see differences. There are a lot of people that have like Italian cypresses that sort of ignite like matchsticks because they have them sort of trimmed so that they have their whole canopy going down to the ground. And those can be kind of dangerous to have right next to your house. Palm trees can be problematic. So yeah, there's all sorts of things that I would strongly recommend avoiding. But there are a lot of native species that I think you should do instead. Is what I'm getting.
Yeah, it was the wood fence that ran the length of the 5-foot setback next to my house that was far worse than any of the native plants in my yard.
Interesting.
Okay, is there any other questions from anyone? Here we go.
Broom. Yeah, we see broom in fuel breaks. We see it along roads. I have this one photo. I don't think I included it, but it shows all this yellow blooming deerweed along Highway 33. But if you look closely, there's also right along the highway, there's all this Spanish broom that's blooming at the same time. Not the same plant. Deerweed is native, and it's a very important native plant. Spanish broom is, as you might guess, not from around here. It's from Spain, and it is it's problematic. It spreads into these areas, and it occupies such a similar niche in the Mediterranean as a lot of species here that it does really well here. And so it's a nitrogen fixing species as well. It's a shrub that can resprout after fire. It's got all the right things that allow it to thrive and in this climate. And so anytime we do some major disturbance activity, road building, fuel break clearing, logging, anytime that happens, there is a high probability that you're going to bring in non-native plant species, either as you're doing it or in the years following. Broom is one such plant. There are several different species of broom. Our main issues around here are Spanish broom in Ventura County. We have some French broom issues closer to Santa Barbara, but also Spanish broom too. And I see them in, there's an area I'm thinking of in a fuel break on Camino Cielo above Santa Barbara that is just huge swath of Spanish broom that came in after all the clearing that had happened. So you've just replaced, all that did was replace one shrub, habitat with another, but that is still flammable and is also not nearly as important for, native wildlife. So great question. Feel free to email me if you think of questions later. Email me, hit me up on Instagram, Bryant the Shrublander. I think it's on the screen still. Yep. I love chatting about these things and talking about this stuff. I recognize some familiar people that were here that I've talked to on Instagram before. So don't hesitate to get in touch if you want to know more about some of these things. I can go deeper, one-on-one if you're interested.
Great. Thank you very much, Bryant.
Thank you.